We have technology. Hey, I'm Nigel Kersten. I'm Field CTO at Puppet. My background is in operations. We're cut a little bit shorter here today, so I'm going to kind of speed things up a little bit. This is my first time getting on a stage in like 2.5 years, which is a little bit freaky. And it sort of feels like nature's healing. I went from flying 200, 300,000 miles a year to zero and spending all my time in my garden. My tomato plants are excellent. But I'm mildly freaked out. So if I look a little nervous here, like this is actually a big deal, hanging out with people in this sort of a venue, which I used to do a lot, but now feels like the before times, before an apocalypse or something. So who here, so we've got 2 meetups. Who's on team DevOps meetup? Who's on team DevSecOps meetup? Okay. Who does both? Stick both your hands up. Cool. We're all one big happy family. So what I'm going to go through today is a bunch of stuff from our State of DevOps report this year, a bunch of the work I do. My job is basically helping really big companies that don't want to change. And I've been a co-author of the State of DevOps report for the last 10 years. So one of the things that everyone always asks me is, particularly if I talk to a DevSecOps crowd, is like, well, what do you think about DevOps versus DevSecOps? Well, this is going to be fun. And it's basically a nerd fight that no one else really cares about all that much. But the argument that normally goes on is something like this. DevSecOps should just be called DevOps, but it doesn't have security in the name. It's just about Dev and Ops. But DevOps was meant to be about more than Dev and Ops. And why is it called DevOps? Because naming things is one of the hard problems in computer science. And I'm going to tell a joke you might have heard before, which is there's only 2 hard problems in computer science: naming things, cache invalidation, and off-by-1 errors. Seriously though, when I interviewed Patrick Dubois, and I know Patrick hates the sort of hero worship that goes on in the DevOps space around his role of essentially being the godfather and nurturing this whole community. When I was interviewing him for this year's report, he came up with this, which I thought was really, really nice. Where he's like, after many, many years of being asked for a definition of what DevOps was, he was like, it's whatever you do to bridge friction created by silos, and the rest is engineering. And engineering is really cool and really valuable. We wouldn't have running water or aeroplanes or electricity or all these really, really fantastic things. But lots of people just do engineering and call it DevOps. And I think this has been, we saw that the DevOps panel that went on about what's the future of DevOps, a lot of these sort of topics came up about what do people actually mean by DevOps? Is it collaboration? Is it empathy? Is it the CALMS model? And all of these things. But what I'm seeing more and more is that at a larger scale, in a large organization, it's really about the people, and not about individual people, but team-to-team interactions. And that these are really difficult problems that most people haven't solved very well inside their organizations. So this year was our 10th year of doing the State of DevOps report. You're going to get used to this little movement that I'm going to have to do to make my clicker work. And so for those of you who know the DORA folks, we worked with the DORA pretty closely for 4 or 5 years, worked together on a lot of these metrics, but it's been 10 years, which is kind of a big deal for something that was just a random idea by Alana, who was one of my ex-co-workers, going, we should do a survey about what is going on with this emerging movement. One of the things we came up with a couple of years ago was trying to help people get started with DevOps, because I think particularly we are the 1% to sort of flip around the 99% thing here. If you're turning up to this sort of a meetup, you're not like most people in IT. You're not even like most people who are trying to do DevOps. Because most people, and I mean this in not a negative or pejorative sense, it's a job. It's a job. They turn up, hopefully 9 to 5. They get good health insurance if they're in America. Otherwise, they're on the street with the rest of the world. Like, it's not a passion for everyone. And I think that's actually okay. Like, many of us should have a healthier relationship with our jobs than we necessarily do. But most people out there aren't sitting there at these sort of events going, well, this is what DevOps means. Let me think about this really deeply. Let's talk to people and build out my plan for adopting DevOps. They end up just someone in there all going, you know what we should do? We should do DevOps. And someone else went, yeah, we should do DevOps. And it's not much more organized than that. And they don't really know how to get started. So one of the things we started a few years ago was this maturity model of trying to give people, the future you're heading for is collaborative teams that are working together with cross-functional skills, shipping value directly to your users without lots of manual handoffs in the way. I'm going to have to keep just walking backwards a little bit over there. So you've probably seen something like this, the big 4 metrics around DevOps. And the main reason I bring this up is, for those who haven't seen the State of DevOps Report, the way we do this is we survey people about their practices, what's actually working, when did they adopt them, and we ask them about some of these key metrics, amongst other things. And you've probably seen this before, this idea of low, medium, high performers in terms of deployment frequency, mean time to recover a change failure rate. And what I think a lot of folks don't realise is this is not a really artificial construct. There isn't a smooth spectrum here that you see when you survey folks, where it's like everyone is at every different sort of possible frequency. People actually divide up into really distinct chunks. It turns out there's lots of people who can only deploy monthly or less often. And then there's actually a sudden jump where they start doing some basic automation, fixing some processes, and they move to daily and weekly. And then there's a much more difficult jump to get to the high level of being able to do this on demand. And for those of you who are in little organizations or even medium ones or even forward-thinking big organizations, again, you're sort of in a minority because a lot of these big companies, it is really, really hard to get to the high bit. I'm not quite sure if I've got a lag or whether... So this is what we've been seeing over the last couple of years. You can see starting in 2018, when we started tracking in this particular way, in the low level, it's getting smaller, which is good. More people should be moving away from only being able to deploy once a month. The really high group is getting larger, which is good. More people should be able to get to deploying on demand. But there is this massive group stuck in the middle, as we've been calling them, who aren't really seeming to progress. And this sort of matched with all of us who are co-authors on the report of what we were seeing out there, that there's a lot of people who are really struggling with how do we actually move to the higher levels of performance. And if you're like me, when you hear stuck in the middle, and this may be a cultural reference that is going to age out rapidly, you are going to hear something. My joke timing is going to be terrible. Oh my God. You're going to hear something like this song, made famous in Reservoir Dogs. How many people actually know what I'm talking about? Okay, cool. So I'm not saying that enterprise IT is like being gaffer taped to a chair while 2 madmen dance around you with razor blades trying to slash your ear off. But I'm also not saying it's not like that, if you know what I mean. So there is something about these groups who are stuck in the middle, and we wanted to investigate them. So the way we do the report each year is we come up with a bunch of hypotheses, because otherwise you just end up with a grab bag of data and you're not really proving or disproving anything. And our theory was that the orgs that are doing well are the ones that have well-defined team roles, team identities that are understood by the teams and the teams next to them, and have well-defined interaction patterns between them. And for those who've read team topologies, you'll be hearing where I'm going here on this. And that the platform team model is the way lots of folks are succeeding at scale. And I think because DevOps was a grassroots movement, one of the things that started early on is we came up with this idea of small autonomous teams. Organizations stole the 2 pizza team idea from Amazon. But most people are not Amazon. They don't have this organizational discipline of everything as a service with really great service discovery. Everyone is highly paid software engineers. Most companies are just not actually like this. And so they try and build these small teams that are autonomous and independent, and they become locally optimized, but the organization and the whole software delivery is not actually all that optimized. You end up with these disconnected islands, and then as soon as you hit someone whose job is governance, compliance, security, your life actually becomes quite difficult because all of these different tool chains are quite different. And you've probably heard someone at a conference in the last year or 2 use the phrase sociotechnical. And this is, again, I think we have good/bad habit in IT of borrowing academic terms and lifting them out of context and deciding to use them for other things. But I think the whole point of talking about socio-technical systems is that we work in organizations with people and with technology, and changes to the people and how they interact change the tech. And changing the tech changes how the people interact. And these things are both mutually reinforcing and mutually destructive in different ways. And our theory was that we spend a lot of time in DevOps talking about process and about tooling, and even though we sort of pay lip service to the idea of empathy and it all being about the people, most big organizations don't actually do that because it's hard. It's hard to define, it's fuzzy, and it's much easier to go, you know what we're going to do? We're going to implement a CI/CD system and call the people who run that DevOps engineers, which is sort of missing the point. So these were the big hypotheses we wanted to test. And one of the things that really struck me as we were going through interviewing folks, because we decided to do qualitative as well as quantitative interviews, was that all of the people who were involved in DevOps in the early days were really into agile. And there was an agile system administration mailing list, and it wasn't as snappy a title, and for whatever reason it didn't really catch on. But you talked to Patrick, and he was even unsure whether he should try and start a conference that was outside of the agile conferences that were going on at the time. And I think this is one of the things we actually kind of forgot, that we pay lip service to these things, but it ultimately all comes down to people. So who's read the Team Topologies book? Okay, you should all totally read this book. So Matt and Manuel wrote a really great book based upon their consulting experience, essentially mapping out what is the model that's in common with large organizations that are good at producing software, that are good at delivering software. And their two simple metrics were, can we deliver software in a fast flow manner, where you're just sort of working really quickly without lots of pauses and interruptions? And can the people who are doing that do that with a low cognitive load, where it's not actually highly stressful to do it? So they came and described this whole model, and we loved it so much that we ended up inviting them to be co-authors of the report with us this year, so we could test some of these hypotheses. It's really, really good. Like, I can't emphasize this enough. They have lots of great material on their website. I think they're running training courses these days. They're about to launch an academy. I genuinely think this is one of the best books on how to do software delivery that's come out in the last 10 years. To sum it up really quickly and not do it justice at all, there are a small number of team types. You have a platform team, a stream-aligned team, which is often your value stream or development team, and then you have these other types of enabling teams and complicated subsystem teams. What I'm going to focus on mainly here is the platform team and the stream-aligned team. Now, if you read this book, lots of people make this mistake of getting to the first chapter and going, this is amazing, here are the team types, that's what I should do. But if you keep going, they go on and describe the interaction paradigms between these teams. And in particular, you'll see here that the platform team, its mode of interacting with the streamlined team, it's not collaborative. And I think this is something else we sort of over-rotated on in DevOps, which was that devs and ops weren't collaborating at all, so we really, really pushed collaboration. And collaboration is really, really important, but it's also really efficient. You're not using Amazon's platform or Azure or Google or Oracle because you're collaborating with their platform engineers. You're consuming it as a service. You know, theoretically, they're collaborating with users to go, what do people want? Let's design a thing they want, and then let's deliver it as a service. And one of my co-authors, Mike Stonky, who's like a classic old school grumpy ops guy, was like, actually the best ops teams where you're the happiest are where you almost never interact with your users because they're just using all of your stuff all of the time at the speed they want to use it. So to spin this back, and before anyone misquotes me as saying collaboration is terrible, I think when you're building self-service stuff, you have to collaborate deeply with your users to work out what they need, but then you want to just make it so they click a button or hit an API call or do something to actually get out of their way. And if you work in a bigger organization or even a medium one, there's almost certainly more people consuming your stuff than you have running the stuff in terms of infrastructure. And so you're never really going to have the time to collaborate with all of them. Oh, it's the poll. I've worked it out. Okay. So we basically validated the core response a core idea of the survey, which was if you go back to these low, medium, high groups, I realise this is a bit of an eye chart, but what we've got over here is this top one is basically a value stream team. Can you independently ship value and deliver it to customers? Second one's basically a platform team. But what I want you to look at, the pattern here, which is that people at the lower levels of evolution have many, many different team types. And some of them are actually anti-patterns, and it was really difficult to try and describe these in a non-pejorative way of like a team that defines the standards that other teams must follow. For most organisations, that's the dreaded enterprise architect team who aren't actually connected with your work, but actually dictate how it happens. And we know this is not the best way to actually architect and decide software. Or to be a team of managers who define and coordinate the goals of multiple teams and departments is not necessarily the best way to operate software in terms of software decisions. So the general trend I want you to look at here is that you see the folks at the higher levels of evolution have focused on several small number of team types, which is the thesis of team topologies. Can we do it from here? Yes. Okay, now as far as identity and as responsibilities go, ask yourself this about your organisation. Does your team understand what its role is and responsibility to other teams? And do you think the teams next to you understand their responsibilities and what your responsibilities are? And you could look at this. This isn't actually about DevOps. This is really about being a functional organisation. And I think most big companies are actually really, really bad at this. And because it's not actually a simple problem to solve and to keep solving in a reliable way. As a bit of an aside, we thought this was interesting looking back at the last 10 years, which was that in about 2018 we appeared to hit peak DevOps team, where people literally had their team's name was DevOps team. My personal opinion is that the only DevOps teams that should exist should essentially be coaches helping people in terms of practices, and they should essentially put themselves out of business at some point. Agile teams don't necessarily make a lot of sense either. And I think also, given the way our industry has a terrible habit of polluting these words, like DevOps, a DevOps team in one org may just run Jenkins. A DevOps team in another org may just write papers for other people to follow. Others may just be a sysadmin team who haven't been changed in any way but have been rebadged as DevOps. I think because we've been like this as an industry, it's not actually a useful descriptive term inside your company no matter what. So I'm actually firmly on the side now of calling yourself a DevOps team doesn't make sense. My worry is that SRE, which was pretty well defined, is heading much in the same direction. And my next bet will be platform team, but I'm going to try and hope that that doesn't hold true. The key that we want to go back to here is that the way you scale out is self-service through APIs, and we see that this is sort of the core of what folks are doing. How am I doing for time? Okay. So I brought up platform team, and again, we are terrible in this industry at reusing words. I'm not that old, and I swear platform has gone through several major redefinitions in the last 10 years, let alone in the last 20 years. And again, we are really bad at naming things. And I actually blame Gartner for this one, because I think they described the platform team approach the best early on, and it just permeated through everyone. Contrasting that, Forrester, who also often have a lot of influence here, used the term automation strike teams, which is fucking awful, to be honest. Even worse than platform teams. For those who don't know what a platform team is, this is not just running your operating system or just running the infrastructure. It's meant to actually be a different way of working and a different mindset, where you build your IT infrastructure becomes a product that's for your users. You're not just exposing APIs and giving raw access to folks. You're actually trying to create a product, have a product mindset, recognize that internally you have users, they have problems, you can't solve all of their problems, but you can solve some of their problems and hopefully keep iterating on them and solving more and more of them over time. It's primarily API first as a service. It's not just old school centralized IT. It's not just a service catalog that requires arcane knowledge to actually create new entries in. And it has product managers inside it. It's not just something where you have devs and ops together, but you have someone whose job it is to evangelize those capabilities in the organization and go, what are the problems everyone has and which ones should we actually solve? So this is actually something that I think is the key to scaling out, particularly in a medium to large organisation, of not just recognising you don't just run IT, you're trying to solve problems for people. And I think it's the natural evolution of what we used to talk about a lot in DevOps, of DevOps is empathy. DevOps is about understanding what other people are trying to get done. As an aside on here, so I spend a lot of time talking to managers who will say to me, my big problem is I don't hire enough people with the right skills. And yet, I am utterly, utterly convinced that almost no company really has a skills problem. They actually have a problem making use of those skills and delivering them to users. They don't do it in an efficient way. Like, there is no way everyone in your organisation is going to become an expert at everything, and yet we sort of have this weird expectation inside IT that new technology comes along, everyone will be an expert in this, and if I don't have 100 people with Kubernetes skills, Docker skills, whatever the flavour of the month happens to be, I'm failing. The big problem, I think, is that we're not very good at going, here is a small group of subject matter experts, let's give them the autonomy and empowerment to deliver their expertise to the rest of the org, and we're going to have lots and lots of pockets of that. On top of that too, I'm convinced that no team, and this is going to sound like bragging, but I don't mean it like this, tech is not that hard. Like, we kind of pretend sometimes it's like nuclear physics or inventing new maths. Teams pick up skills if they have the safety and the empowerment and the engagement to actually do it. Like, I don't want to belittle too much what any of us do, but none of it's that hard. And if you actually have the time and inclination to do it, you can learn it, because we all share lots of knowledge. So I'll get slightly off my hobby horse there. But so to sum up all of that section as advice, define your team roles. Bonus, actually name them things that are relatively meaningful and easy for people to discover. One of the interviews we did for State of DevOps Report this year, someone was talking about the fact they have several different service management systems inside their organisation, some of which haven't been updated for several years. So if I knew that I wanted Barry to do something because Barry's team's responsible, but Barry's service entry changes are actually in this other system that hasn't been updated with the org chart for 5 years, I need to know what team Barry was on 5 years ago to file the service request just so it ends up in the right spot. And this is not actually all that uncommon. Like, we talk a lot about single source of truth, but I think we've got to really try and make it obvious what are team roles, identities, and how do we define the interactions between them. And the simplest way I have of formulating what a platform team's about is, if you've got multiple teams that are having the same problems, consider forming a team to solve and own those problems. It's no more complicated than that, really. If you look at the news, I believe it's even happening with cocaine shipments coming into the UK. Different gangs are starting to consolidate and share logistical platforms, and then they just divide the containers up when they arrive. There was all this fascinating stuff in The Guardian about it. I swear, that's what. Okay, so jumping onto the other bit. We went into the survey thinking that we talk a lot about, in the earlier models around DevOps, culture, automation, measurement sharing, culture, automation, lean, measurement sharing. And culture is just this really fuzzy bucket. And I don't know if any of you follow Simon Wardley on Twitter, who's kind of hilarious and really, really sharp, but he pointed out a while ago, which got me thinking, anthropologists haven't got a definition of culture. Literally the people who you would think would know best, it's this really fuzzy word that anyone who works in sociological fields, they don't really try and define. They try and get much more specific than this. And one of the things we found so this is the advice, stop talking about culture, start solving specific problems. Because we found that the people who are at the higher levels of evolution, they didn't actually ever describe any of their problems as culture problems. It turned out the less evolved you were and the lower performance you were in terms of DevOps, the more likely you were to say, we have a culture problem. And it started to become apparent to us that when you describe your problems as being culture problems, people give up and they go, it's like climate. I can't fix that. If we have a culture of no accountability, how can I, as a single engineer or a single manager, actually fix this problem across the organisation? You think of culture as being immutable or difficult to change. But if you instead focus on the specific things that are inhibiting whatever you're trying to get done, it becomes a thing you can actually carve up into chunks and solve. And specifically, and this is one of the really great things we went through with the team topologies guys, was that if you focus on the things inhibiting fast flow, you start to get actionable results that do change your culture. Changing your blocking dependencies, getting rid of temporal coupling in your systems, getting rid of lack of autonomy to decide and deciding I don't need a committee going through this change request. I can instead just give this team the responsibility, because if the shit hits the fan, they're the ones who have to deal with it anyway. And if you make more and more of those sorts of decisions and clarify team purpose and interactions, you start to actually have an impact on culture. And this was really eye-opening for me, and it was really, really concrete that as soon as you interviewed folks, as soon as they started to hit the medium and higher levels of performance, they stopped talking about any problems as being culture problems. But everyone at the lowest level complained about their culture all of the time. So I've been talking a bit about outside the teams and sort of team-to-team interactions. Wow, I just went through. So if you haven't read Google's rework stuff, it's really, really good. And I spent a couple of years at Google well before they learnt these lessons. And it's actually really frustrating looking back at my time there and thinking about how much effort was spent trying to hire the perfect shaped individual for teams, and for then the whole organisation to recognise later on that it actually really doesn't matter about the individuals anywhere near as much as the team dynamics. And they spent lots of time studying this. All of this stuff's online on Rework with Google. And these are the 5 factors. And I mentioned psychological safety earlier, but I genuinely think this is one of the most important things. And if you look at these things, this sounds like a team you want to be on. And these are the teams I genuinely believe are the ones that will acquire skills as they actually need them. And these 5 factors matter way, way more than whether you're hiring people with the right skills. Because the reality is you're going to hire someone, they're going to be with you ideally for at least a couple of years on your team, and the world is going to change. What is going to be the skill they actually need is going to be radically different in the future than it was when you originally started hiring them. Okay, so the other 2 things we wanted to look at was along the theory of it's not really about technology. And this is a bit frustrating sometimes working at Puppet, where you talk to people and they're like, we bought your software, or we've deployed your open source software, and so now we're doing DevOps, which is absolutely and utterly not the case. We wanted to understand the relationship between automation and the higher levels of evolution. And this is not really a shocker probably for this crowd, but just doing automation doesn't make you highly evolved in terms of DevOps. Lots and lots of people stuck at that mid-level actually have pretty high levels of automation going on. But being good at automation is what gives you the bandwidth and the space to actually start addressing systematic issues. And being good at self-service automation enables higher degrees of performance because it gives you even more bandwidth and gives you even more scale and more impact across the org. And the big thing here I think that's critical is that back to that product team mindset, to be good at self-service automation requires people skills. What are the problems they're actually trying to solve? I'm not just going to take, these 5 or 6 APIs from the vendor or the software I've installed and expose them to my end users. Try and actually work out what are the problems they're solving and give it to them in a modular and composable way. What are my responsibilities to the team? How do I evolve this over time? It's not something that you do and then it's done. You should be treating it like a product. And this is what I genuinely think is the real key from going from automation to self-service automation is what actually gives you the scale. So you can see here, lots of these people, the biggest thing I see moving from low to medium is that people are drowning in repetitive tasks, which isn't giving them the freedom to actually systematically improve their environment. And most people agree, even from mid-up, that automation improves the quality of your work. The other misnomer that we wanted to address was that we're seeing increasingly one of the flavors of misinterpretation of DevOps is people going, I'm using the public cloud, therefore I'm doing DevOps. I'm using APIs and programmable infrastructure. So we wanted to assess how cloudy was people's cloud usage. And this is a little contentious for a bunch of folks, but we decided to use NIST's cloud capability metrics. Is the stuff you're providing, is it on demand self-service? Are you making use of that from your cloud provider? Can you do it from anywhere on the network? Are resources actually pooled? Is there rapid elasticity? Like the things you think of when you think of using the public cloud. And this was really, really striking to us, that the people who are really, really good at DevOps were actually much better at using the cloud like the cloud. And the people who weren't tended to have either lifted and shifted, and honestly, they're treating it like VMware that I no longer have to administer myself, but I'm still going to run these VMs that are long-lived with heavyweight processors and not actually change anything. It turns out that, to wrap all this up, tech is necessary, but it's not sufficient. You can't really do any of these major improvements without the scale and leverage that automation and using programmable infrastructure, public cloud will give you. I'm convinced healthy teams will acquire the skills they need. Your company, if it's struggling with having the right skills, probably has a problem working out how to deploy the value those skills create rather than a shortage of the skills itself. But in order for all of this to work, you need to have really strong team identities that are widely understood, and people understand what their interaction paradigms are like. And to go back to that, because I skimmed over a little, it's like a platform team should not be collaborating with all its value stream teams all the time, but it should collaborate in designing the products and every so often touch in to work out how do we want to keep evolving that product as people's needs change. And that the key to scaling out is honestly self-service and as-a-service delivery, all of which actually requires skills with people. And I think this is one of the things that the whole DevOps movement, DevSecOps has done to our operations and security spaces is, like, if you want to be taken seriously by the business, you've actually got to get out there and start talking to other people and understanding their needs. We can't sit in the basement anymore. Apologies for the rush, but we have lots of really good panelists, and so I wanted to try and get them on. Thank you very much.